I am Count Bobula, and I bid you welcome to Dustio Movies, where we're counting down the top 10 old-school vampires. To qualify as old school, a particular vampire has had to have made his or her first appearance before 1970.
The reason for this cutoff year is because in the 70s, they actually remade and homaged several classic vampire films, and we want to stick to the originals.
So stretch out in your coffin and have yourself a Bloody Mary as we count down the top 10 old school vampires. Number 10 on our list is Lon Chaney as the man in the beaver hat in London After Midnight.
Inspector Edward C. Burke is investigating a murder at an England estate. However, vampires also seem to be haunting the estate. At the end, it's revealed that it's not a vampire after all, and it's just Inspector Burke in disguise. But that's how American horror films were in the 20s, so this still counts.
The last known copy of this was destroyed in a fire in 1967, so I can't judge the performance, other than assuming it was good because it's Lon Chaney. But what puts him on the list is the makeup.
The shark-like teeth, exaggerated grin, and bulging eyes is so creepy and creative. Lon Chaney did the makeup himself, as he always did. In fact, he was known as the Man of 1,000 Faces.
At the time, the makeup was so terrifying, it inspired a real-life murder. A man named Robert Williams was in Hyde Park, London, with his lady friend, Julia Madigan, who he intended to marry. Suddenly, he had an epileptic seizure, and thought he saw Lon Chaney as the vampire trying to get him. During the hallucination, he killed Julia. The judge sentenced him to hang, but he was reprieved, and he was sent to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. And that's what it takes to get a spot on my list, because it gives these photos, which are all we have, an air of mystery, horror, and real-life murder. Number 9 is that little old lady from Transylvania, the terror of Borgo Pass Boulevard, Martina Hunt as Baroness Minster in The Brides of Dracula.
Produced by the famous horror studio Hammer, this film is a sequel to Horror of Dracula. In the last film, Dracula bites the dust. But terror remains in Transylvania as Baroness Minster gives her vampire son a steady stream of victims. But when Baron Minster escapes, he turns his mother into a vampire. Baroness Minster doesn't start off as a vampire, but she acts like one because she's the one getting young women for her son. She's a wealthy, matronly woman who acts like she's trying to help, but there's a dark aura around her where you know she has evil intentions. I especially love her relationship with her son. She hates his existence, but also feels guilty because they used to be close, and she's the one who encouraged him to hang out with a wild crowd, like Satanists or another rowdy bunch. And that's how he became a vampire. Then that poor prisoner in the tower, he is your son. He was my son. Now he is only a beast of the night. After she becomes a vampire, she actually becomes less evil and realizes the error of her ways. It's usually the opposite with vampires, but I think this makes her more interesting, and the perfect number 9. I see you're thirsty for more. Number 8 are the vampires in The Last Man on Earth. Based on the novel I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, a plague has swept through the earth, and Dr. Robert Morgan is now the last human alive. However, he is not alone. He is constantly under the attack of a mob of vampires.
These vampires sound a lot like zombies, but with good reason. Most zombie films are influenced by Night of the Living Dead, but Night of the Living Dead was influenced by this. These vampires are slow-moving, I'm gonna get you, and not too bright. I graduated in the 6th grade! But it doesn't bother me, because they're only in a few scenes. But they create such an atmosphere. They're all Robert thinks about and works on. During the day scenes, we see several other dead bodies, so we get the impression that there's millions of them. And there are great scenes where Robert is sitting in his living room, and we hear the moaning and knocking of the vampires.
Come out, Morgan. Morgan, come out. We're going to kill you, Morgan. We're going to kill you.
This huge mass of vampires is so eerie and claustrophobic, you feel like you're constantly surrounded. Although this film's influence has been more on zombies than vampires, it's a unique vampire innovation nonetheless. Number 7 is just the way I like them. Dark hair, brown eyes, and pointy teeth.
Ooh la la.
It is Gloria Holden as Countess Maria Zaleska in Dracula's Daughter.
The film is a sequel to Universal's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, and takes place where the original leaves off. Van Helsing has driven a stake through Dracula's heart. Talk about heartburn! And his daughter is torn between her natural desire for blood and a longing to be cured of vampirism. Universal did several other Dracula films, but none of the actors were able to successfully follow in Lugosi's footsteps, except for Gloria Holden, whose vampire captures the same flavor of Lugosi while making it her own. With her eyes and pale skin, she resembles Lugosi. Like Lugosi, there's a sexuality to her character, but this time it's with males and females, making her the first lesbian vampire on screen. And she even says some of the old Dracula lines.
No thank you, I never drink wine. One of the complaints about the movie is that Dracula's not in it. But she so well captures that haunting quality, you still feel his presence, and it makes the conflict between her and her father more internal. Gloria also projects this self-loathing and longing, where you sympathize with her, but balances it with a vampire's ruthlessness, so she's still a threat. It's not easy to follow in Bela Lugosi's footsteps, but Gloria Holden does it. As sure as my name is Bobby, our number 6 is Boris Karloff as Gorko in Black Sabbath.
Black Sabbath is a horror anthology film with Boris Karloff as the host. There are 3 stories in total, but the Verdelok is the one that involves vampires. A Russian family is terrorized by the Verdelok, which is a vampire that feeds on the ones they love best. Gorko, the head of the family, selflessly goes out to kill the Verdelok, but warns his family if he is gone for more than 5 days, they need to kill him, because he will have become a Verdelok himself.
Best known for playing Frankenstein's monster, Boris Karloff was a horror icon who specialized in playing well-nuanced horror roles, and I think this is his scariest performance. When he comes home, his family is terrified because they don't know if he's a Verdelok or not. We know he is. Now, Gorko is calm most of the time, but occasionally has outbursts of temper. But we always feel this vampire insanity underneath. However, Boris plays it ambiguously, where you don't know if he's trying to fight his vampire urges and try to be the man he was, or if he's just trying to cover up the fact that he's a vampire to make his family easier to kill. This ambiguous quality is that it's most terrifying when he's holding his grandson. Is it out of love, thirst, or both? Because the Verdelok kills the ones they love.
Why did you leave us?
Father, I had to leave. He loves me. No one can love you as much as we do. You know that. You mustn't be afraid of anything.
Why did you leave us? Why did you leave us?
This was Boris's only vampire character, but he's so frightening and crazy in it. It's a good thing Bela Lugosi didn't see this. As far as old school vampires go, Gorko isn't talked about much, maybe because it's just part of an anthology, but he is certainly a vampire to remember. Not all vampires are scary. Some have a biting sense of humor, like our number 5, Al Lewis as Grandpa on the Munsters.
The Munsters was a 1960s sitcom about a family of monsters who believe that they are the typical American family. Instead of dentures, this grandpa has fangs. He is Count Dracula. Grandpa is the perfect funny vampire. He has a pet bat named Igor and a vampire-themed car, the Dragula, which was made from a real fiberglass coffin and is one of the grooviest cars you'll ever see. He also dabbles as a mad scientist, where he performs wild experiments in the dungeon, and he performs magic, but being a little long in the tooth, he typically goofs up.
Herman, suppose I turn myself into a horse. You mean you'd be the busting bronco I ride at the rodeo? Ah, animal pills. Now watch me turn into a horse. Grandpa, you've gone and made a pig of yourself.
Give me another pill, stupid!
As great of a spoof of Dracula as he is, what makes Grandpa so funny and lovable is Al Lewis. Along with having great comedy skills, Al put a lot of himself into the role. So as batty as he is, he feels genuine, and his relationships with the other characters feel genuine.
Fred Gwynne, who plays his son-in-law Herman, was his real-life buddy, and on screen they're like a classic comedy team, with Grandpa being bossy and sarcastic, and Herman being this big goof. He also has a real natural rapport with his grandson on the show, Eddie.
In real life, Al Lewis totally embraced his character. He had a restaurant called Grandpa's, and even told people, "Call me Grandpa." And he made this vampire a hilarious and endearing number 5. Now for a frightening number 4, Christopher Lee as Count Dracula.
In the late 50s through the groovy 70s, the horror studio Hammer rebooted several of the old Universal monsters, most notably in Horror of Dracula. As usual, Count Dracula is out for blood, and the good guy, Professor Van Helsing, is out to stake him. But what makes this one stand out from its predecessors is its inglorious color. There's bright red blood, a startling Dracula theme music, dun dun dun, which if you listen to it is actually saying the word Dracula, Dracula. And of course, it has Christopher Lee.
As Dracula, Christopher Lee is a tall, ominous figure. But what separates him is when necessary, he makes good on that threat and is a physical powerhouse. He's like a wild animal. He's constantly running, jumping, hissing, fighting, and throwing people around. This Dracula doesn't turn into a bat or wolf, but he doesn't need to. He's got this. He also has the best Professor Van Helsing as an adversary, Peter Cushing. And when the two are on screen, it's always exciting and unpredictable. I'll stop you, Dracula. I'll kill you, Van Helsing. In terms of movies, Christopher Lee is the most prevalent Dracula, appearing in 7 Hammer horror films and then 2 other ones. His performance changes slightly from film to film. In the first one, he speaks normally, just unusually fast. Other times, he speaks in a deep Dracula voice. And other times, he won't even talk at all. Unfortunately, his films tend to vary in quality. Christopher Lee even complained about this. They would come up with a story, and then figure out some way to get Dracula in it. So some of the films don't have enough Dracula, and instead focus on the often uninteresting normal characters. However, Christopher Lee is still an action-packed number 4. Number 3 is the scary silent type. Max Schreck is Count Orlok in Nosferatu.
Nosferatu follows the basic plot of Dracula, but with enough changes to avoid paying the film rights. Instead of going from Transylvania to England, they go to Germany. And instead of Dracula, there is Count Orlok, who's far more repulsive and grotesque than even the Dracula in the book. Count Orlok has a bald, bulbous head, long fingernails, bat-like ears, and these 2 fangs in the middle that make him look like a rat. They also shoot many of his scenes in the German Expressionism style, where you see these great shots of his shadow, making him an even more larger-than-life figure of doom.
Max Schreck, whose last name means terror in German, that lucky ducky, is just that. He is terrifying. He moves very slowly, but every so often there's a fast jerk, so you know he has speed. Schreck was a method actor, and you could tell in his performance how into his character he was. So much so that it even sparked an urban legend that he really was a vampire. Another thing that makes Orlok so creepy is he brings with him an entourage of rats with him wherever he goes to spread the plague. So he's not only the fantasy terror of being bitten, he's also the real-life terror of disease-ridden rats. Ugh. It also solves the problem that a lot of Dracula films have, where the opening scenes in Transylvania are the scariest part, and then when they go to London it's a bit of a letdown. Because of the plague, Germany has an even bigger sense of dread than Transylvania. Most vampires have trouble during the day, but not on number 2. For him, the witching hour was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Jonathan Frid as Barnabas Collins on Dark Shadows.
Dark Shadows was a daytime horror soap opera focusing on the Collins family and their cousin Barnabas, who, unbeknownst to them, was a 200-year-old vampire. After the introduction of Barnabas, the show would also include witches, werewolves, warlocks, and even time travel.
Barnabas Collins was the first reoccurring vampire character in a dramatic series, so they were able to do things with him that had never been done before. Originally, he was a strictly evil vampire, who after drinking the blood of Maggie Evans, tries to brainwash her into believing that she is his lost love, Josette Dupre. Now, Jonathan Frid was a Shakespearean actor, and he brings this classical quality to Barnabas, which makes him being 200 years old suddenly believable. And Jonathan Frid also found the humanity in the character. The writers jumped on board with this, and they added the ghost of his little sister Sarah to the story, to remind him of the man he was.
Barnabas, do you remember the poem you taught me when I was learning how to write?
Yes, I remember how proud I was of you.
Say it for me now.
Evil is wicked, it is well understood. The wicked are punished, so you must be good.
I will never come back, Barnabas. That is your punishment.
No, Sarah, I forbid you to leave. I beg you to stay.
After the initial Barnabas story, the show went back in time to 1795 to show how Barnabas became a vampire. Jealous of his love for Josette Dupre, Angelique the Witch puts a curse on Barnabas that whoever he loves will die. I think this is the greatest evil character origin story that I've ever seen. You understand why Barnabas becomes so lonely and evil, and it introduces Angelique, and the two have a love-hate relationship throughout the series. When they return to modern times, Barnabas becomes cured of vampirism and becomes the protector of the Collins family. Then, he vamps out again when he goes back to 1897, but this time he's the anti-hero and uses his vampire powers to protect his family, but is still willing to kill when necessary. So Barnabas grows throughout the series. We see both good and evil in him, and he's highly interesting and relatable.
Dark Shadows aired at 4 o'clock, and kids across America were running home from school to see it. It was a social phenomenon. Barnabas became a teen idol, and they even did a hit movie, House of Dark Shadows. Jonathan Frid would appear at Dark Shadows conventions until he died, which is how I met him, and I even got his autograph. He was truly spooktacular. Now for our number 1. I'm sure you're dying to know who it is. It is Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula.
Real estate agent Renfield goes to Transylvania to sell Count Dracula a house in England. Dracula makes Renfield his slave, and once they arrive in England, he puts the bite on Lucy and Mina, and only Professor Van Helsing can stop him.
When you think of Dracula, you think of someone suave, with black hair and a widow's peak, wearing a tuxedo and cape, and speaking in a thick Hungarian accent. That's not what Dracula is like in the book. The pop culture image of Dracula is based entirely on Bela Lugosi, and with good reason. He was amazing. Like the character, he was actually born in Transylvania. Scary already. He starred in the Broadway play, and then did the movie in 1931. Now remember when I said that American horror films in the 20s always had a logical conclusion? Dracula broke that custom. He really was a vampire. And it was the first supernatural horror film ever done in sound, making Dracula the first talking monster, in Lugosi's genuine Hungarian accent and one-of-a-kind line delivery that makes him truly sound like the undead. I am Dracula. I bid you welcome.
Count Dracula lives in an awesomely designed spooky castle. He has vampire brides, and a lunatic slave named Renfield who eats spiders and flies. Bela as Dracula is evil incarnate. Just look at those vampirish eyes. However, he also infused the role with his own personal magnetism. We are drawn to him just like the characters. Bela was also the first to bring a sexual element to the character. In the 20s, the exotic foreigner Rudolph Valentino was the #1 male hottie, and he had just recently died. To audiences, Lugosi seemed like a Valentino from hell. Before going on, Bela would repeat to himself, "I am Dracula, I am Dracula," like self-hypnosis. Combine that with authentic aspects of himself and great acting, and it makes it seem like Lugosi and Dracula are one and the same. And it's horrifying.
Lugosi became forever identified with the role, so much so that when he died, he was buried in full Dracula costume. Even creepy Max Schreck didn't do that. He played vampire characters in Mark of the Vampire and Return of the Vampire, and was officially Count Dracula again in the brilliant horror comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. He steals the show there because he's able to do a few funny lines and have a silly plot, while retaining the same dark intensity and everything that worked so well in 1931. Ah, young people, making the most of life, while it lasts. Count Dracula is the epitome of a vampire, and Bela Lugosi is the epitome of Count Dracula, thus making Bela Lugosi's version of Dracula the #1 old-school vampire. I hope you've enjoyed your look at the top 10 old-school vampires, and have a spooktacular Halloween. Stay thirsty, my friends.